Hey guys, tonight we wander into the sun-baked, sand-blown and thoroughly disordered world of the Crusades, where religious devotion, ruined roads, ill-fitting armor and a truly impressive run of poor decisions all collided at once. Whether you happen to be a knight, a farmer, or simply a person who owned one stubborn donkey, this was an age with a real gift for upending your week and, on an unlucky day, trimming your lifespan. Before we go any further, if you find something worthwhile in these long, slow histories, feel free to leave a like and to subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy the company here. And do let me know down in the comments where in the world you're listening from and what the hour is where you are. It never stops being fascinating to see how many corners of the globe are quietly gathered together at once. With all of that said, let's make our way back into the past. So, picture this. You have just stood through a sermon. A loud, impassioned, faintly menacing sermon delivered by a man in heavy robes who spoke at great length about sin, about salvation, and about how the distant city of Jerusalem is, in some way he never quite explained, everyone's personal responsibility. You are not entirely certain where Jerusalem actually is, somewhere east of France, you suppose, and a good deal south of your pig farm. You nod along anyway. The preacher tells you that the Pope himself, from far away in Rome, has proclaimed that anyone who takes up the cross and joins the great expedition will receive a full pardon of their sins. Historically, this was Pope Urban II, who made his famous appeal at Clermont in the year 1095, and the promise he offered was known as an indulgence. To you, that sounds like an excellent bargain, particularly after the business you got up to last spring behind the mill. You had assumed no one saw that. Apparently, heaven keeps careful records, and besides, if you're being honest with yourself, you are bored. You have ploughed the very same field for 14 years running. Your diet consists more or less entirely of barley, onions, and whatever failed to leap out of the stew pot in time. Someone in the crowd mentions eternal glory, and glory, frankly, sounds a great deal more appealing than milking goats in the rain for another decade. So you sign your name to it. Or rather, you get gently talked into it during a tavern conversation, one that somehow swelled into a solemn holy vow after 3 mugs of thin, watery ale and a badly misplaced feeling of being unstoppable. You wake the following morning with a pounding head, clutching a wooden cross and, for reasons unknown, a pair of boots that are not yours. Even so, you feel a swell of pride. You are now, officially, a crusader. You have a cross stitched onto your tunic, a blessing spoken over you by the local priest, and a hazy but confident notion that this whole affair will conclude with you being buried in gold and gratitude. You have also been given, in the way of practical preparation, precisely nothing. No military training whatsoever. No map. As for armor, you have none. You were simply told to bring whatever you could find, and so you now stand equipped with a kitchen knife, a frying pan, and the last few scraps of your dignity. Your neighbour Gerald has brought a rake and a genuinely aggressive attitude. You tell your family you are departing in the name of God. They ask, quite reasonably, whether God intends to feed you along the way. You laugh. You should not have laughed, because you have just become part of one of the most disorganized and poorly planned mass movements in all of human history. You are about to march thousands of miles with no logistics, no dependable supply line, and considerably more spiritual confidence than good sense. And you have not yet even left your village. Before you take a single step, someone presses a shirt of chainmail into your arms, and it smells as though it recently lost a wager. You were promised armor of the noble, gleaming, heroic sort. What you have received is a second-hand iron sweater, complete with rust stains, old sweat, and a faint, clinging aroma of disappointment. It is heavy. Not merely a little cumbersome, but genuinely, structurally heavy, the way a small blacksmith's shop would be heavy if you tried to wear one. Simply pulling it over your head feels like being embraced by a sullen anvil. You are also handed a helmet, conical, dented, and clearly forged by a man who bore some personal grudge against the human neck. There is no padding inside it at all, only cold metal, and the gentle sensation of your skull being slowly cooked. For your legs, there is wool. Only wool. Proper armoured greaves are reserved for the wealthy or the very fortunate, and you are neither. So you wrap your shins like a rather sad parcel, and hope the cloth will absorb at least a fraction of the thousands of stones you are shortly going to tread on. As for footwear, if you are expecting boots of hardened leather and heroism, adjust your expectations. You are wearing worn-out turn shoes, soft leather slippers that scarcely keep out the mud, never mind the conditions of a battlefield. Within the first mile, you have developed a blister ambitious enough to found its own parish. Then there is the surcoat, the brightly coloured cloth worn over the armour to signal which side a man belongs to. Yours is white, or more accurately, it used to be. It is now a vague sort of beige freckled with mysterious spots, and it slaps against you like a wet flag with every stride. A red cross has been daubed onto it in haste by a fellow who, in his other hours, sharpens the tusks of pigs. There is no consistency anywhere across this army. One man is fully clad in mail. Another is wearing a cooking pot on his head. Gerald once again is shirtless, carrying a wooden shield he whittled himself, upon which is scratched in rather poor Latin the phrase, "Jesus, watch this." You attempt to fasten your belt, cinch it far too tightly, and nearly faint. Your sword, if you were lucky enough to borrow one at all, is dull, badly balanced, and seems to harbour a personal dislike of you. Still, you tell yourself, I look like a knight. You do not. You look like a frightened turnip wrapped in steel and optimism. But it is far too late for second thoughts. You are packed, dressed, and entirely unprepared. It is time to march. The trumpets sound. Or perhaps it is only a man shouting. Either way, the crusade is on the move, and so, very slowly and very uncomfortably, are you. This is no glittering cavalry charge. This is a long, groaning shuffle across the face of Europe, thousands of confused and underfed souls dragging carts, goats, children, and at least one man who has flatly insisted on bringing a piano. Everyone is armed, though only some of the weapons were ever meant for fighting. One man marches with a pitchfork, another has lashed a hammer to a broomstick and named it God's toothpick. You have hardly left the village, and already your shoulders feel as though they have been cursed. The mail bites into your neck. Your shoes are quietly turning your feet to soup, and your pack, which contains exactly 2 onions and 1 elderly biscuit, seems to gain weight with every step. Someone sneezes behind you. You briefly consider running away. Then there is the noise. Everyone is talking, arguing, praying, singing, or coughing, often several at once. A nobleman rides past and bellows something rousing, something like, "Forward, men," before vanishing for the remainder of the day. Meanwhile, you trip over a rock, injure your pride, and are promptly stepped on by a passing donkey. The sun is out and cheerful. You are neither. You are perspiring in places you did not know were capable of it. Your water is already warm and tastes of iron and regret, and your legs are chafing in a manner that feels distinctly like divine correction. There are rules, naturally. March in ranks, though somebody has already wandered off into a beet field. Ration your food, though Gerald has eaten his entire week's supply before midday. Respect the villages you pass, which you sincerely try to do, right up until you learn they are charging half a chicken merely to draw water from the well. And then the rains arrive. Just as you begin to imagine you might be adapting, the sky opens like a sarcastic blessing. Your surcoat clings to you like guilt. The roads dissolve into slick rivers of mud. You fall twice, once forward and once backward, and the goat, you are fairly sure, laughs. By nightfall you have covered 12 miles and aged roughly 12 years. You lie down in the wet grass beside a man whose name you do not know and whose snoring may well qualify as a weapon of war. You sleep like a brick dropped in a bucket, which is to say badly, and with consequences. Only 2,000 miles left to go. By the fourth day, your stomach has begun singing hymns for food, loud and desperate ones, the sort usually reserved for funerals. You were told the army had provisions, and technically that is true. It is simply that those provisions are variously mouldy, missing, or being quietly hoarded by a man named Brother Ulrich, who claims to be fasting for spiritual clarity while, you note, chewing on something in the dark. Breakfast, on a good morning, is a lump of black bread so dense it might reasonably serve as siege equipment. You gnaw at it for 20 minutes, make no measurable progress, and eventually keep gnawing simply because your teeth have grown bored. Your companion insists there is a nail baked into his loaf. No one is remotely surprised. Lunch is worse, chiefly because there is no lunch. There is only the fond and distant memory of lunch. You eat a handful of dried peas that taste of despair and medieval dust, while beside you a man proudly produces a salted fish he has been carrying in his sock. You decline, politely, and give some real thought to fasting for spiritual clarity yourself. By late afternoon the whole column is hungry, short-tempered, and beginning to see things. One fellow is convinced he has spotted a fig tree. It is a scarecrow. Another has started licking his sword, announcing that it tastes of glory. It tastes of rust, and he is now, sadly, the proud owner of a case of tetanus. The plain truth is that feeding a moving army is, in the technical sense, a logistical nightmare. The supply lines stretch for miles, are badly managed, and are now and then set upon by the local farmers, who would understandably rather not surrender their entire winter's food to a crowd of crusaders who just trampled their turnip fields. So you forage. You find a bush heavy with berries. Gerald assures you they are perfectly fine. Gerald has also, at one point in his life, eaten a candle. You take your chances. They are not fine. You spend the next 2 hours behind a tree, reconsidering most of your recent decisions. Dinner is stew. Glorious, mysterious stew. No one can say with confidence what is in it, and everyone eats it regardless. You encounter something chewy and wisely choose not to inquire. One man swears it is rabbit, another suggests it is boot leather. Both, honestly, seem plausible. By nightfall you are full, though not of food so much as of regret. You dream of bread that does not fight back, and of cheese that is not green on purpose. You have never in your life missed your mother's onion soup so keenly. And it is still only the fourth day. By this point in the journey, matters are settled. You smell of wet iron, of regret, and of something you are quietly praying is not fungal. Hygiene, once a proud ambition, has been demoted to a faint memory, filed somewhere alongside clean socks and personal boundaries. You have not bathed in over a week, and neither has anyone else. A fact you know because the entire crusading host has developed what historians might charitably call a strong collective aroma. You are all one great walking wheel of cheese, composed of sweat, dust, and honest medieval body odour. There is no soap. Should a man claim to possess soap, he is either lying or has carved something soap-shaped out of tallow and pure self-delusion. You do have water from time to time, but it is largely spoken for, reserved for drinking, or for pouring over open wounds while making a great deal of noise. Washing your actual body with it is a luxury kept for nobles and for men with considerably fewer blisters than you. Your clothes, once stitched so proudly with their red cross, now resemble a battlefield rendered in fabric. Your undergarments have, in certain regions, fused directly to your skin. Your boots are damp, arguably alive, and unmistakably resentful. And the lice. Oh yes, the lice have moved in for good. You give them names. You attempt, at various points, to negotiate. They are winning handily. One night, a man near you becomes convinced his helmet is haunted. It is not haunted. It is merely head lice throwing a party. You begin to itch after dark, and so does everyone else, until the scratching becomes the unofficial rhythm of the march, a steady scratch, scratch, shuffle, groan. You briefly weigh the idea of bathing in a river, approach the water, and discover it to be freezing, filthy, and already occupied by a stranger weeping quietly into his underclothes. You nod at him with great respect and walk away. As for other bodily necessities, there are no latrines. You go where you can, behind a bush, beneath a wagon, or simply wherever your dignity finally decides to give up entirely. Privacy is out of the question. You now share a small collection of unforgettable eye contact memories with men you will never see again. And then there is that one fellow. No one knows his name. Somehow he remains spotless. His armor gleams, his face is clear, and he smells, impossibly, of lavender. He is either a genuine miracle or a shared hallucination, and either way you have come to resent him deeply. You have begun to dream of soap, of warm bath water, of dry feet, but most of all of a single breeze that does not carry the scent of 30 unwashed men and one regrettable pot of stew. You are not clean. You are not even remotely close. This, it turns out, is crusade clean. And to think you had assumed that the men with swords were going to be your greatest problem. The greatest danger on a crusade, it turns out, is rarely the enemy you marched all this distance to meet. It is the man 3 rows back who has just coughed something almost biblical into the shared air. Welcome to the real crusade, the quiet campaign to survive your fellow crusaders and their immune systems. Medieval medicine in this age is less a science than an interpretive dance performed with herbs. Fall ill on the road, and you can look forward to one of 3 treatments: prayer, bleeding, or being firmly told to walk it off. None works especially well, least of all when the thing you have caught is spreading faster than gossip through a monastery. It begins innocently enough. A sniffle here, a cough there. Someone is quietly sick behind a bush, and everyone politely agrees not to notice. By the next morning, 5 more men are coughing. Gerald has developed something alarming and faintly purple on his neck, which he insists is only a heat rash. You begin, quietly, to plan your own funeral. The tents that once sheltered the army are converted, one by one, into infirmaries, or as they are known along the crusade, the places where hope goes to wheeze quietly. The healers are hopelessly outnumbered. Their chief instruments are cloth bandages, leeches, and sheer conviction. Sometimes they burn herbs over the sick. Sometimes they merely wave a bundle near your face and wait for you to recover out of pure awkwardness. The symptoms, meanwhile, are anything but subtle: fever, chills, nausea, swelling, and a broad sense that your organs have organized themselves into a labor strike. You resolve to be brave. Then you watch a neighbor being treated with a heated iron poker and discover that you are, suddenly and miraculously, feeling a great deal better. Sanitation, it must be said, remains largely theoretical. Waste goes into whatever field happens to be nearest. Water is questionable at the best of times and openly hostile at the worst. You crouch to refill your flask from a stream, only to notice 3 horses a little way upstream treating that same water as a latrine. You drink it anyway. Hydration is hydration. The priests announce that the sickness is a test sent from God. The knights are equally certain it is the work of the devil. A barmaid who, for reasons no one can quite reconstruct, joined the march somewhere back west, suggests it might simply be because nobody ever washes their hands. She is, of course, immediately ignored. You try, sensibly, to keep your distance from the afflicted until the day you realize that everyone is afflicted, yourself included. Your throat burns. Your stomach is sending a series of mixed and urgent messages. You weigh your odds of survival and recall that your last proper bath was sometime last month. The mathematics are not encouraging. And the true indignity is this: you have not yet fought a single enemy. You are losing a war to invisible things in the soup. You have been marching for days now, hungry, itchy and mildly diseased, and you naturally expect a warm reception from the towns along the way. You will not receive one. The locals are, to put it gently, unenthusiastic. They regard your crusading party rather the way a shepherd regards wolves who have taken to wearing crosses, with suspicion, tension, and an urgent instinct to hide the livestock. From their vantage point, you are less a holy army than a slow-moving catastrophe. Thousands of unwashed strangers shouting in broken Latin, trampling the crops, borrowing everything that is not securely nailed down, and singing war hymns at midnight with the collective pitch of tone-deaf ghosts. You stop at a town hoping to trade for food. The villagers bar the gates. The local bishop peers down from a tower and makes the sign of the cross over you, less in blessing than in self-defense. A monk offers a single cabbage in exchange for your leaving faster. The language barrier does not help. You attempt to ask for water and somehow end up demanding a man's wife. You try to explain the sacred purpose of your journey and instead appear to propose marriage to a goat. The goat, for the record, is not interested. Negotiations collapse quickly. If you do manage to talk your way inside a settlement, what follows is generally price gouging, open staring, and comments about your smell. You buy bread older than your boots and ale that could double as furniture varnish. Someone kindly gives you directions to Jerusalem. You follow them faithfully for 2 full days, before understanding that they were simply steering you toward the next village, which wanted nothing to do with you either. In foreign territory, the arithmetic only grows worse. The locals do not merely dislike you, they would prefer you gone. They care little for your papal blessings or your hand-stitched banner. They want their goats returned, their fields left standing, and their peace restored. Given that some of these places had recently been visited by earlier crusading parties, who also swore they were only passing through, trust sits at a historic low. In one town, a child hurls a turnip at your head, and it lands with the finest accuracy you have seen all week. You arrived seeking salvation. They see a broke, heavily armed tourist with a poor grasp of boundaries, and, if you are honest, they are not entirely wrong. So you are on the move once more, marching east. There are no signs at the roadside reading this way to Jerusalem, and a good portion of your company believes the Holy Land lies just a little past Constantinople, a city they also cannot reliably locate. Your commander does possess a map of sorts. It is a hand-drawn scroll depicting 3 towns, 2 rivers, and what appears to be a dragon coiled in one corner. You suspect the artist was blessed with a vivid imagination and cursed with poor geography. Even so, the commander brandishes it like Holy Writ and bellows forward. At every fork in the road, on the theory that confidence matters rather more than accuracy. Now and then a local guide is hired. He is offered a few coins, a skin of wine, and a vague assurance that he will not be trampled. He nods with great wisdom, points firmly to the east, and then vanishes before breakfast. You are beginning to suspect that east simply means not here. One man swears he remembers the route from a dream. Another claims he once read it on a scroll. Gerald, still shirtless and increasingly sunburned, announces that he is following divine whispers carried on the wind. The wind, as far as you can tell, is saying only that you are lost. You ford the same stream 3 separate times in a single day. You pass a rock you are nearly certain you have passed before. A monk assures you it is a different rock, and a holier one at that. You remain unconvinced. The terrain shifts without warning from forest to swamp to mountain. One stretch of road runs so steep that your boots slide more than they step, and half the army ends up shuffling sideways like a column of confused crabs. Spirits are low, feet are lower. Then someone finally says the unspeakable thing, "I think we took a wrong turn." You are hundreds of miles from home, surrounded by companions who believe cartography is a kind of pastry, and no one will be the first to admit that you are lost. So you keep marching, proudly, aimlessly, and faithfully all at once. Every direction leads somewhere, whether to Jerusalem, a Byzantine outpost, or yet another unlucky goat village. Onward you go regardless, sustained by divine purpose, stale bread, and the group's shared refusal to concede that you are walking in a very large circle. You had imagined the fighting would be glorious. You pictured banners rippling, swords meeting with poetic timing, enemies collapsing in tidy, choreographed heaps like something from a troubadour's epic. What you actually receive is dirt in your mouth, noise in your soul, and an unsettling suspicion that no one, on any side, quite knows what they are doing. The first thing you register is the screaming, not only from the enemy or your own ranks, but from everyone, yourself very much included. There is a battle strategy, in theory. In practice, it consists largely of shouting "charge" and hoping the other fellow is more confused than you are. He is not. Your helmet narrows your vision to a slot. Your sword is heavier than it looked when you bought it. You reach for your shield, and remember it is lying on the ground behind you, because Gerald borrowed it to cook bacon and neglected to hand it back. The archers loose their arrows before anyone is ready. The front line surges forward while the rear line panics and surges the other way. A man is knocked down by his own horse. Another defends himself with surprising commitment using a frying pan. You watch a soldier trip, stab himself in the foot, and begin loudly blaming the devil, and honestly, he may have a point. You run toward the chaos because everyone else is running toward it, and social pressure is a powerful force even in wartime. Dust fills the air. You swing wildly at a helmet and strike home, only to realize the helmet was your own. Your scream is loud and, in its way, very brave. You lock eyes with an enemy soldier and understand, with real horror, that he is perhaps 15 years old and considerably more experienced than you. You briefly consider playing dead. You briefly consider genuinely being dead. both hold a certain appeal. Horns are blowing, orders are shouted in 5 different languages, and somewhere nearby a voice is singing what sounds unmistakably like a tavern song about sheep. Whether this is intimidation or simply madness, no one can say, but it is unquestionably working. After a while, and you truly have no sense of how long, the noise begins to fade. The survivors crawl away, panting and bruised and smelling of old stew and poor decisions. You are one of them, bleeding somehow from the ankle, though you cannot recall the moment it happened. Gerald has your helmet now, and he is using it as a soup bowl. So, was it glorious? Not exactly. But you are alive, and on a crusade that is about as near to victory as most people are ever likely to come. The weather in the Holy Land, or more precisely along the long, winding disaster of a road toward it, is not your friend. It is not even a neutral acquaintance. It behaves like an enemy commander, with far better timing than your entire army. One moment it is sweltering, the sort of heat that turns your chainmail into a cast-iron oven. You sweat through your clothes, your armour, and a fair portion of your soul. Your leather boots seem to sizzle against your skin. A knight beside you swears he has seen a mirage of a tavern shimmering on the horizon. You believe him completely, because you saw it too, and the two of you weep a little, quietly. Then, just as you have made peace with being slowly roasted, the heavens change their mind. Clouds roll in like an offended bishop, the sky darkens and the rain arrives. Not a polite rain, not a gentle drizzle, but the vengeful, thunder-torn kind that seems drawn from Scripture. Your surcoat clings to you like a wet shroud. Your feet squelch with every step, so that you sound like a remorseful duck. Your tent gives up almost at once. You seek shelter beneath a tree, which proves to be the favoured gathering spot of 3 equally soaked goats and 1 man who has abandoned all ambition and is reciting psalms to his own knees. The roads dissolve into mud. You slip twice. Gerald slips 3 times, once landing face first in a cow patty. You do not laugh aloud, but somewhere deep inside, your soul permits itself a small chuckle. And then, of course, the cold. Once the sun withdraws, the desert changes its temper, like a baron, 3 cups into a feast. You go from sweating in your boots to shivering like a cursed tambourine. Your fingers cease to cooperate. Your sword feels less like a weapon than an ice sculpture. You attempt to build a fire and fail, repeatedly, discovering that the only thing drier than the wood is your morale. Weather builds character, they say, though character does little to prevent a chill caught while scraping mud off your eyebrow with a broken spoon. This is crusading. You are not merely fighting for the faith, you are fighting the atmosphere itself, and the atmosphere is winning. You came, you were told, to fight the infidel. That was the whole simple promise of it. A clean contest between one side and the other, tidy and easy to explain. Except now you have noticed something awkward. Half the people on your own side cannot even agree on which holy calendar to keep, let alone anything grander. You are from Western Europe, Latin-speaking, loyal to the Roman Pope, and, it must be admitted, faintly unwashed. And now you are meeting Byzantines, who speak Greek, who cross themselves in a different manner, and who regard you with all the warmth of a suspicious cat. They are, in principle, your allies. In practice they have bolted the city gates and invited you to wait politely outside, watched over by archers. The priest travelling with your company declares the Eastern Church heretical. The Byzantine bishop, for his part, describes you as an unlettered goatherd who bathes too little and sins too freely. The two nod at one another and perform civility while murmuring spiritual threats beneath their breath. And beyond even them, there are the local Christians, older communities here long before you arrived, Christian Arabs, Armenian Christians, and Syriac Christians, each with their own tongue and rites, and their own wariness of the armed strangers now passing through their homeland. Before you set out, you pictured the East as a single, uniform place, everyone on the far side of it sharing one faith and marching under one banner. The reality proves far less tidy. Now you find yourself squinting at strangers, trying to sort friend from enemy by the way they murmur the Lord's Prayer, and you are, it must be admitted, dreadful at it. One afternoon you accidentally menace a party of monks, and in return they set your tent alight. That is only the start of the confusion, because the Muslim world is no more a single army than your own. There are Fatimids ruling from Egypt, Seljuk Turks pressing in from the east, and a scattering of local warlords who fight one another whenever they can spare a moment from fighting you. Just as you settle on who the enemy is, a banner changes colour, and someone switches sides in the middle of the campaign. The man you were chasing last week is now warming his hands at your fire, patiently explaining regional politics while eating your last onion. Your commander tries to gather the various factions for a council. It dissolves almost at once into a shouting match over whose patron saint outranks the rest. Gerald proposes settling the matter with a duel, and no one objects. Nor is the trouble confined to outsiders. Knights bicker with bishops, nobles quarrel over the division of loot, and the foot soldiers drift into little prayer circles of their own. At one point a man announces that he has seen the Virgin Mary in a chicken coop and promptly founds a breakaway sect. They charge the wrong hill. Religious unity, such as it was, lasts roughly 3 days. After that, everyone is mostly hoping not to be knifed over a liturgical disagreement about the proper keeping of Lent. God may well be on your side, but everyone else is plainly on edge. When you signed on, you imagined marching shoulder to shoulder with noble warriors, disciplined knights, and devout men bound to a sacred purpose. This was, it turns out, optimistic. You are in fact travelling with one of the oddest assortments of humanity ever gathered outside a tavern brawl. On your left is a toothless baker who packed a rolling pin instead of a weapon. On your right is a man named Tibble, who insists he is a monk, yet swears without pause, drinks whatever sits in the nearest jug, and has, beyond much doubt, stabbed someone over a loaf of bread. Gerald, still refusing a shirt, has drawn a cross on his chest in soot, and introduces himself as God's muscle. Your commanding officer is a 19-year-old noble with an abundance of hair and no strategy whatsoever. To him, tactics means pointing dramatically and shouting. During one skirmish he charged off in entirely the wrong direction and ended up in a cabbage field, and he maintains to this day that it was part of a master plan. Then come the true believers, the ones convinced they cannot be harmed because heaven favours them above all others. They wade into the fighting without shirt, without shoes, sometimes without so much as a sword, carrying nothing but conviction and a stout stick. Their survival rate does little to recommend the method. A merchant has attached himself to the column, selling relics of highly questionable origin. One day he offers you the thumb of St. Peter, the next the official crusaders' toothpick. Both look remarkably like ordinary twigs. There is even a band of children, actual children, and no one can say where they came from or who thought to bring them, yet they have kept pace for weeks and somehow hold better spirits than anyone else. At night your companions sing, argue over scripture, and scuffle over who stole whose crust of bread. One man has proclaimed himself Bishop of the Tents, and now delivers daily sermons from the top of a barrel. His theology is shaky, and his balance shakier still. The one thing binding this company together is shared misery and a vague, ever more muddled ambition to reach somewhere holy without dying along the way. You genuinely cannot decide who is stranger, the enemy across the field or the fellow beside you who has fashioned a spear from a soup ladle. But this much is clear: you are not in good company, you are in strange company, and strange company tends to get lost together. At last you reach your destination, or at least a city grand enough to look worth storming. There are walls, tall and thick, and behind them people who plainly wish you elsewhere. So, naturally, the order comes down: lay siege. In theory, it sounds magnificent. In practice, it is medieval camping with weapons and a great deal more sickness. The army settles just beyond arrow range, or so you hope, and prepares to wait for days, weeks, or possibly the remainder of your natural life. The plan is to starve the city out. The small difficulty is that you forgot to bring food, sanitation, siege engines, or anything else of practical use. Someone attempts a catapult. It collapses on the spot. A battering ram is assembled from a tree trunk, 4 ropes, and pure enthusiasm, and lasts all of 10 minutes before the defenders, who are clearly the more practiced hands, set it ablaze. You dig trenches, you raise towers, and you complain at length. Then it dawns on you that the people inside are doing perfectly well, waving down from the ramparts as they munch olives and lob the occasional insult, or worse, over the side. Rain comes. Everything turns to mud. Your socks dissolve, your tent leaks, and your stew tastes of rope and quiet betrayal. Gerald catches a rat and names it dinner. Morale sinks to a new low, partly because someone tried to play the lute last night, and it sounded like a goat drowning in wine. And then there is the smell. Thousands of unwashed soldiers, spoiling food, and the odd dead horse, a scent capable of stripping the gilt from a relic. The camp priest declares the stench a test of faith. You are fairly certain it is a health hazard. When at last you try to storm the walls, ladders go up and arrows come down. You manage 2 rungs, cry out, tumble off, and land on a defender who was, at that very moment, about to surrender. The assault fails, and everyone agrees afterward that they were merely probing the defences. Weeks drag on. Supplies thin. Tempers fray. At one point, a man proposes eating the mascot goat, and a brawl erupts. The goat wins. A siege, you come to understand, is not about action at all. It is about boredom, foul air, and the steady effort to recall why you came here in the first place. One morning, with the sun rising a touch more grandly than usual, a sound rolls through the camp. The gates stand open. Whether through starvation, sabotage, or some quiet stroke of divine scheduling, the walls have finally given way. You expect trumpets, glory, perhaps a chorus of angels. What you get is unfiltered chaos. Out of pure habit, you thank them. Inside there is smoke and shouting, and no one can tell who belongs to which side. Everyone is looting, yelling, or expiring dramatically in a corner. A knight gallops past, clutching a chandelier. Gerald has discovered a barrel of wine and now styles himself Lord of the Alleyway. You lose your footing, then your helmet, and at one point your patience, in a drawn-out argument with a stubborn door. You were promised a holy war. What surrounds you looks more like a holy rummage sale run by chaos itself. Any chain of command has evaporated. Your noble commander is too occupied posing for portraits that no one is painting. The priests are crying out, Deus vult, God wills it, while tucking relics into their robes. One man swears he has glimpsed the Holy Grail. It is a soup bowl with a dent in the rim. As the dust settles and the city is declared secured, which here means still smoking and largely emptied of valuables, you stand among the wreckage and wonder whether this was ever the plan. You find a relic, or what might be one, a small bone that could belong to a saint or, just as easily, to a chicken. Into the bag it goes. You have also acquired a goblet, a tapestry far too large to carry, and someone's deeply bewildered cat. Yet the victory feels odd. You had expected to feel righteous and triumphant. Instead you feel tired, sticky, and faintly guilty, standing amid weeping townsfolk and shattered doors, no longer certain whether this was about salvation or plunder. The line between the two has grown hard to see. A priest pats your shoulder and assures you that God is pleased. You nod, though you are not entirely convinced. You came in search of heaven and found Ash, Noise, and Gerald being unwell over a relic. You made it. You survived the marching, the hunger, the siege, the fevers, the arrows, Gerald, and the occasional divine misunderstanding. Technically you have won, and yet here you sit on a broken crate in a city you helped to ruin, struggling to recall what your life was like before you joined a holy war organized by amateurs with swords and untreated fevers. You have changed, though not in the uplifting, I have seen the world and grown as a person sort of way. You are thinner, filthier, and somehow both older and younger at the same time. Your soul feels 15 years heavier, yet you are still scolded like a child by a man whose sole qualification is owning a finer hat. You have developed a small twitch whenever anyone says the word pilgrimage. Your armor no longer sits right because your body has reshaped itself around every bruise and every night spent curled up in a leaking tent. Your sword is notched, your faith is complicated. You once believed in clear lines, good and evil, saved and damned. Now you mostly believe in sturdy shoes and not eating anything still moving. Back home, they will call you a hero and ask what it was like, and you will smile and say it was incredible because deeply chaotic, morally muddled and perpetually damp does not sit well in a tavern tale. You may even polish the relics you carried off, mount them on the wall, and pretend you understood the plan the entire time. You will nod gravely during sermons. You will avoid meeting a goat's eye. But deep down you will always hold the quieter truth that you did not so much crusade as survive a travelling disaster with a cross fixed on top. Gerald will write poetry. Badly. Someone will found a cult. You will make a discreet donation to the nearest monastery and never once mention the day you mistook a bishop's hat for a stew pot. Was it worth it? History will answer yes. You might answer yes as well, though the twitch in your left eye suggests otherwise. The Holy Land lies behind you now, and so does most of your composure. Long before samurai drilled with the katana, before gladiators traded blows on the sand of Roman arenas, 2 young Egyptian men circled one another in the desert. Their arms were lifted, their knees bent, their feet planted firmly in the sand. One fainted, the other lunged. There were no swords and no armor, only skill, strength, and the roar of a crowd gathered beneath the burning sun. This is ancient Egyptian wrestling, the oldest documented martial art known to history. More than 4,000 years ago, long before anyone imagined an MMA gym or an Olympic podium, the people of the Nile had already refined the art of hand-to-hand combat. In a Middle Kingdom tomb at Beni Hassan, archaeologists found wall paintings depicting more than 400 distinct wrestling holds, locks, and throws, a training manual set into limestone. This was no crude brawling. It was a considered system of physical control and quiet psychological mastery. In Egypt, wrestling was more than sport, it was a mark of standing. Boys were trained in it from an early age, and matches featured in both military drills and public festivals. Soldiers grappled to keep their edge. Nobles competed to display their strength. Even pharaohs were said to wrestle, not out of necessity, but to show the divine vitality that ran in them. The techniques themselves are strikingly familiar. Shoulder throws, hip tosses, single-leg takedowns, anyone who has watched modern wrestling or judo would recognize the movements at once. This was not a forgotten pastime, but a polished tradition, one that helped lay the groundwork for the martial arts still to come. And unlike the later systems that wove together weapons and philosophy, Egyptian wrestling was something purer, the human body alone, honed to master another. Yet it carried a spiritual dimension too. Ancient texts and temple carvings hint that wrestling was linked to the gods, and above all to Horus, who struggled against the god. In a sense, those Egyptian matches were never only tests of strength. They carried the weight of ritual, brutal, and yet oddly graceful expressions of a universe kept in balance. Through them, Egypt became an improbable cradle of organized martial tradition. Long before monks folded into meditation or warriors raised their voices in battle chants, the people of the Nile simply wrestled, in silence, on sand, for the sake of honor. And in that quiet contest, something was set in motion that the world would carry forward for thousands of years. If the wrestlers of Egypt fought for honor, the gladiators of Rome fought for something far plainer, the chance to see another day. Their stage was no sandy courtyard, but a vast stone amphitheatre, ringed by the roar of tens of thousands. And behind every gladiator who lived to raise his arm in triumph stood something harder still, the ludus, Rome's school for gladiators, where martial skill was fused with the cold precision of military engineering. To the Roman imagination, violence was never merely a diversion. It was art, politics, and power braided together into a single spectacle. Gladiators were not crude brawlers. They were shaped, sorted, and honed like instruments. Each man was trained in a particular style, with techniques matched to his armor and his role in the arena. The retiarius moved with a net and a trident, relying on speed and the art of entanglement. The secutor carried a short sword and a heavy shield, built to pursue and to overwhelm. Every step was reasoned, every opening studied in advance. Overseeing this whole machinery stood the lanista, the hard-edged instructor who ran his school much as a modern fight camp is run, only with far less mercy. Many of the fighters were enslaved people or prisoners taken in war, and they endured relentless routines, strength drills, sparring, and mock combats fought with wooden weapons until the movements became instinct. Their bodies were forged into weapons, not for the open battlefield, but for the sand of the arena. And this truly was a martial art. The gladius, the short thrusting sword that gave the gladiator his name, had been refined across centuries of Roman military life. Fighters learned exact angles of attack, careful footwork, and the management of distance. They were taught to read an opponent's breathing, to feign, and to strike in the moment least expected. The aim was not only to defeat, but to hold a crowd. Yet the story was not one of cruelty alone. A few gladiators passed into legend. Spartacus above all, a former soldier turned rebel who broke out of the training school at Capua and came close to shaking the Roman Republic to its foundations. Others won their freedom through sheer survival and became the celebrities of their age, admired like athletes and envied for their skill. Roman martial training was severe but methodical. It stripped a man of everything he had been, then rebuilt him as a fighter whose life depended on discipline, technique, and endurance. It was never simply a game. It was a spectacle, and every arena a small battlefield where an ancient tradition was recorded in sweat and sand. Far to the east, long before Kung Fu amazed the wider world or Judo entered the Olympic Games, a quieter martial tradition was flourishing in the green landscapes of southern India. Its name was Kalaripayattu, and it was more than a fighting method. It was a sacred discipline, a kind of warrior's yoga, and a form of living theatre handed down across countless generations. Often called the mother of all martial arts, Kalaripayattu traces its origins back more than 3,000 years, with legend tying it to the mythical sage Parashurama, the warrior saint said to have raised the land of Kerala out of the sea. Setting myth aside, it remains one of the oldest surviving systems of combat and among the most graceful. Where Rome prized raw force, Kalaripayattu placed grace, flow, and spiritual alignment first. Training began in the Kalari, a sunken earthen pit that served at once as a practice hall and a temple. There, barefoot students learned to move as animals move, with the steadiness of the horse, the spring of the lion, the strike of the serpent. Every motion was tied to breath, to energy, and to rhythm. Before a weapon was ever placed in their hands, students spent years mastering control of the body, learning kicks and open palm strikes. Then came the weapons, and with them a fearsome elegance. The urumi, a flexible, whip-like sword that coils around the body as it moves, is perhaps the most striking and dangerous of all, and also the most poetic. A single mistake could wound the wielder rather than the opponent, so mastering it demanded absolute concentration, faith in one's own breath, and years of patient practice. What set Kalaripayattu apart, though, was not its arsenal, but its philosophy. Its practitioners studied Ayurveda, the traditional Indian system of medicine, so that they might heal the very injuries their art could cause. They learned the marma points, the pressure points believed to govern the body's life energy. The purpose was balance rather than ruin. Even in a fight, the art favoured restraint, timing, and inner stillness, the marks of a warrior sage rather than a mere destroyer. By the time colonial powers reached India, Kalaripayattu had become a quiet emblem of native resistance, and it was banned by the British, who feared it might feed rebellion. For decades it survived underground. Yet, much like the coiling urumi, it drew back only to return, fluid, disciplined, and enduring. It was never only a martial art. It was a living philosophy, a measured dance, a quiet hymn to life. Picture now a mist-wrapped temple set among the mountains of Hainan in China. A shaven-headed monk stands in silent meditation, candles glowing around him. Then, on a single breath, he bursts into motion, fists carving the air, body turning through smooth, connected strikes. This is Shaolin Kung Fu, where a fighting art became a spiritual road, and combat itself took on the quality of prayer. The roots of Shaolin martial arts reach back to the 5th century, when the Indian monk Bodhidharma is said to have arrived at the Shaolin temple. As the story goes, he found the monks too weak in body to sustain their long hours of meditation, so he taught them a set of exercises, part Qigong and part self-defense, that grew over time into the very foundation of Shaolin Kung Fu. But the aim was never simply stronger muscles. At Shaolin, every movement carried both a purpose and a philosophy. Body and mind were treated as one. A punch was not merely a blow but an expression of inner clarity. A block was not resistance but redirection. Zen Buddhism taught non-attachment even within the fight, for to strike in anger was already to have lost. True mastery meant the conquest of the self. The training was demanding. Monks held their stances until their legs shook, struck at trees to toughen their limbs, and balanced on poles to sharpen their focus. They learned to echo the movements of animals, tiger, crane, snake, leopard and dragon, each with its own rhythm, strategy and meaning. The tiger crushed, the crane slipped aside, the snake flowed, and the dragon transformed. Weapons practice was no less exacting. Monks were even taught to turn simple farming tools into means of defense. The reason was plain: Shaolin Kung Fu was not built for conquest but for protection of the temple, of the people and of the spirit. In time, the Shaolin monks passed into legend. They drove off bandits, resisted invading armies, and stirred the imagination of rebel movements. Their skill was feared enough that emperors both sheltered and hunted them. Through the Ming and Qing dynasties, they were by turns honored and pursued. Temples were burned and crackdowns came, yet the Shaolin spirit endured, spreading outward to shape Japanese karate, Korean taekwondo, and much of global popular culture, from the films of Bruce Lee to the wider screen. Shaolin Kung Fu was always more than a martial art. It was enlightenment set in motion, a sacred choreography of balance, discipline, and unbending will. In feudal Japan, the martial arts were bound up with something larger than combat, a whole code of living etched into the warrior class known as the samurai. At the center of their world stood Bushido, the way of the warrior. It was not a fighting style in itself, but a philosophical spine that ran through every strike, every step, and even the manner of one's death. The samurai were far more than soldiers. They were living embodiments of discipline, loyalty, and precision, and their training might begin as early as the age of 5. At its heart lay kenjutsu, the art of the sword. The katana was not merely a weapon. It was regarded as the very soul of the samurai, keen, balanced, deadly, and beautiful. Each drawing, cut, and return of the blade followed a ritual rhythm. That training was as much inward as outward. Beyond the sword, samurai studied jujutsu, the grappling used when a blade was lost, and kyujutsu, the art of the bow. A warrior was expected to command several disciplines, not for battle alone but for the growth of character. They meditated to cultivate zanshin, a state of complete awareness. For in a duel, a moment's hesitation could be fatal, and composure under pressure was simply a matter of living. Perhaps the most striking part of the samurai tradition was its psychological depth. Bushido asked for honor even in defeat. A warrior learned to accept death as part of life, neither to fear it nor to flee it, but to meet it with grace. A samurai who had been dishonored might perform seppuku, a ritual taking of one's own life meant to restore dignity. It was severe, but in that world integrity was held to weigh more than breath itself. Samurai martial arts kept changing across the centuries, shaped again and again by circumstance. During the long peace of the Tokugawa era, martial skill turned more reflective. Schools of swordsmanship began to prize mental clarity, posture, and presence over sheer power. The greatest masters, Miyamoto Musashi among them, set down treatises that wove combat technique together with Zen thought. His Book of Five Rings still stands as a cornerstone of martial philosophy. In due course, the age of the samurai passed, but their traditions lived on, folding into modern kendo and aikido, and even leaving a mark on the ethics of Japanese business. The samurai spirit survives today, not only in the training halls, but in books, in film, and in the quiet discipline of those who still follow the warrior's path. For the samurai, the martial arts were never really about winning. They were about becoming worthy of the sword one carried. When people picture the martial arts, their thoughts tend to travel straight to Asia or to Rome. Yet across the vast and varied continent of Africa, ancient warrior traditions flourished, too, fierce, intricate, and too often overlooked. From stick fighting in Ethiopia to the Nguni spear dances of the south, these were fighting arts drawn not from manuals but from lived experience, from survival and deep cultural roots. Among the Mursi and Suri peoples of Ethiopia, warriors practiced donga, a form of stick fighting that was rough yet closely governed by ritual. Long polished staves were wielded in high-stakes bouts, and though they could leave bruised faces and broken bones, these were never mindless brawls. A donga duel was a rite of passage, a measure of manhood and courage, and even a form of courtship, for a victory could bring status, respect, and the notice of a future wife. Farther south in the Zulu lands, martial skill was raised almost to a national ideal. Under Shaka Zulu in the early 19th century, the traditional stick fighting called Induku grew into a full system of battlefield tactics. Shaka reshaped African warfare by trading the throwing spear for a short stabbing spear and drilling his warriors in close formation. His impis practiced disciplined charges, feints, and encircling maneuvers, and their footwork, shield work, and coordination could stand comparison with the Roman legions. Yet these traditions were never only about fighting. They were woven deeply into culture. In Angola, the fluid and acrobatic art sometimes called engolo, rooted in dance and ritual, filled the air with spinning kicks and evasive turns, resembling a graceful contest as much as a struggle. And it did not remain in Angola. Enslaved Africans carried it across the Atlantic, where it grew into capoeira in Brazil, one of the most distinctive martial arts in the world. Across the continent, warriors also folded rhythm, music, and performance into their training. War dances served a double purpose, to unsettle an enemy and to rouse the body, and their movements mirrored animals, spirits, or ancestors. Combat here was not a purely physical act, but a link to heritage, to identity, and to the sacred. Though colonial rule suppressed many of these traditions, they never truly vanished. Today, in African villages and modern gyms alike, they are quietly returning, valued not only as fighting systems, but as cultural treasures. The African martial traditions remind us that the warrior's path is measured less by fame than by resilience, community, and memory. And when people imagine the Vikings, they tend to summon horned helmets, a detail history does not actually support, along with wild beards and raids remembered chiefly for their violence. Behind that theatrical picture, though, lay something cooler and more deliberate, a system of martial training built on survival, discipline, and hard practical efficiency. The Norse were far more than seaborne raiders. They were disciplined fighters who held combat in genuine reverence, and their beliefs turned death with a blade in hand into the noblest end a person could hope for. Their martial training unfolded in no marble hall or serene temple. It happened in the smoky warmth of longhouses, in open clearings, and on ground frozen hard by winter. From boyhood, Norse children were shaped toward a single ambition: to grow strong enough to guard their kin, to seize new territory, and to earn a name that the sagas might one day carry. Weapons practice began young, first with wooden imitations for repetition and safety, and only later with tempered steel. The sword, the axe, and the spear formed the backbone of Viking warfare. Short swords served well when the fighting closed to arm's length, but it was the bearded axe, broad, weighty, and unmistakable, that became the mark of the Norse warrior. Fighters drilled at hooking an enemy's shield aside, at stripping a weapon from an opponent's grip, and at delivering a decisive blow with cool accuracy. Nothing was practiced for show. Every motion existed to bring the encounter to a swift close. Yet it would be a mistake to picture Viking combat as reckless flailing. It was measured and deliberate, built around tight shield walls, coordinated pushes, and feints meant to draw an opponent off balance. Disputes could also be settled through the holmganga, a formal duel bound by rules and honour. These single combats measured far more than raw power. They weighed a fighter's composure, his steadiness of nerve, and the precision of his technique. Beyond the body, Norse martial discipline was woven tightly into belief. Warriors trusted that Odin, god of both war and wisdom, looked on as they fought. The berserkers, remembered for entering battle in a trance of fury, were said to draw on the spirits of animals, bear, wolf, or boar, through ritual and altered states. Whether history or legend, their story reveals the spiritual charge that ran beneath Norse warfare. And above it all hung Valhalla, the hall promised to those who fell bravely in battle. That promise did more than romanticize combat. It shaped the very way Norsemen fought, without fear, without pause, wholly committed. To flee was to surrender paradise. To hold one's ground was to purchase eternal renown. Though the Norse left behind no formal manuals of their fighting methods, their approach still echoes in today's reenactment communities and schools of historical combat. They were not the mindless brutes of later caricature. They were, in their own way, careful artisans of conflict, shaping victory out of steel, effort, and an unshakable faith in their gods. Far to the south, in the heart of ancient Persia, beneath the low-domed ceilings of the Zurkhaneh, the house of strength, warriors trained towards something larger than mere fighting skill. They trained to become upright men. Here the disciplines of the body met spirituality and a sense of national identity, forming one of the oldest continuously practiced warrior traditions anywhere on earth, known as Varzesh Palavani. This Persian art reaches back more than 2,000 years, to the days of the Achaemenid and Sassanid empires. At its center lies Palavani, a system that blends strength training, wrestling, and combat drills with religious and moral teaching. The word Palavan means more than champion. It describes a noble warrior, one who shields the weak and stands for justice. Training unfolded inside the Zurkhaneh, a gymnasium treated as a sacred space where ritual mattered as much as effort. Practitioners, barefoot and bare-chested, moved through choreographed exercises in time with a beating drum and the chanting of the moorshed, a singer and spiritual guide who set both rhythm and tone. The drills involved whirling heavy wooden clubs, swinging weighted maces, hoisting broad shields, and drawing iron bows, all shaped to build explosive strength and supple movement. One might think of it as an ancient form of high-intensity conditioning, threaded through with poetry and prayer. But the true core of the tradition was Kushti Palavani, Persian wrestling. Unlike the modern Olympic sport, this was at once a contest and a rite of passage. Bouts were fierce and highly technical, prizing throws, leverage, and a deep humility of spirit. Simply winning was never the point. A genuine Pahlavan had to be gracious in triumph and dignified in defeat. In its philosophy, Pahlavani drew heavily on Sufism and Zoroastrianism. Fighters were taught to cleanse not only the body, but the soul. Strength without humility counted as weakness. A victory won without compassion counted as disgrace. Seen this way, the Zurkhaneh was never simply a gym. It was a forge for character. During long stretches of foreign rule, especially under Arab and later Mongol dominion, the Zurkhaneh quietly became a refuge for resistance. Persian pride and identity were kept alive in sweat and som, and the practice of these arts turned into a gentle emblem of cultural endurance. Today, Varzesh-e Pahlavani survives still, recognized by UNESCO as a piece of intangible cultural heritage. Modern practitioners may trade loincloths for track trousers, but the underlying spirit holds. In Persia, the strongest warrior was never the one who struck the hardest. He was the one who trained the hardest, lived most nobly, and lifted others with every stride. From the dust of Egyptian tombs to the mountain temples of Shaolin, from the icy fjords of Scandinavia to the sun-warmed courtyards of Iran, the ancient martial arts were never solely about war. They were, in truth, blueprints for how to live, how to face death, and how to move through the world with purpose. Empires have long since crumbled and old blades have rusted away, yet their influence still hums through modern life, often in places we scarcely think to look. Step into a mixed martial arts gym in almost any city, and the lineage of these traditions is visible in every corner. Wrestlers dive for takedowns much as their distant Egyptian forebears once did. Striking coaches drill spinning kicks that recall the movements of Kalaripayattu. Fighters push themselves with the same fierce dedication that once shaped gladiators and samurai. The wrapping is new, but the underlying principles, discipline, timing, balance, are as old as civilization itself. Beyond the competitive arena, martial arts have become something close to a shared global language. In schools and temples from Tokyo to New York, countless people practice karate, taekwondo, kung fu, and capoeira, not chiefly for fighting, but for confidence, clarity, and a sense of belonging. What once began as the training of warriors has grown into forms of therapy, meditation, and even quiet cultural diplomacy. Many older traditions have enjoyed a revival as well. Indigenous African fighting arts such as Ngolo and Donga are being carefully preserved by historians and practitioners intent on reclaiming their heritage. In India, Kalaripayattu is experiencing a renaissance, with teachers blending its ancient sequences into modern approaches to fitness. Shaolin monks now travel the world, performing feats that once defended monasteries from invaders. Perhaps the deepest inheritance of these arts, though, lies in their philosophy, the conviction that strength must be balanced by humility, that a victory means little without virtue, and that the truest opponent is often found within. In an age drawn towards speed, spectacle, and instant reward, these old systems offer a quiet counterweight, a reminder to breathe, to slow the pace, and to train with intention. Technology has transformed how conflicts are waged, drones, firearms, machines, yet it has not altered why people still train. The wish to master the body, to still the mind, and to walk the path of the warrior remains a common human thread, older than any king and more durable than steel. The art endures because the warrior spirit is never truly lost. In ancient Egypt, beauty was not vanity, but something closer to virtue. The Egyptians held that a person's outward appearance mirrored their inner harmony, and to be beautiful was to fall into step with Ma'at, the divine order that governed the cosmos. Cleanliness, fragrance, and adornment were not indulgences. They were understood as spiritual obligations. Each morning, women and men alike moved through careful routines of grooming and beautification. The desert sun was merciless, and the humidity of the Nile unforgiving, so Egyptians applied unguents, soft blends of animal fat, beeswax, and oil, not merely to soften the skin but to shield it against harsh weather and disease. These balms were often perfumed with myrrh, frankincense, or lotus, scents believed pleasing to the gods. Fragrance was not reserved for the living either. It was applied to the dead as well, to sweeten their passage into the afterlife. No routine felt complete without kohl. This famous dark eyeliner was made from galena, a lead-based mineral ground into a fine powder and worked into oils or animal fat. Its purpose went beyond allure. Kohl shielded the eyes from the sun's glare and was thought to turn away malevolent spirits. Its careful application produced the almond-shaped, arresting gaze that looks out from countless temple carvings and royal portraits, from Cleopatra to the boy king Tutankhamun. Cosmetics carried real spiritual weight, and their colours held meaning. Green eyeshadow, made from malachite, stood for rebirth and was linked to the god Horus. Red ochre brushed onto lips and cheeks was meant to summon vitality and joy, and to honour Hathor, the goddess who watched over beauty and love. Even wigs made a statement, fashionable, yes, but also practical, letting the wearer keep the head shaved and cool beneath elaborate constructions of human hair, beads, and gold wire. Beauty was a marker of status too. The wealthier a person, the more elaborate the cosmetic box. Elite women kept their preparations in jars of alabaster or faience, while commoners made do with simple pottery. At banquets, scented cones of wax were set upon the wigs, melting slowly through the evening to release their perfume, a mingling of hygiene, allure, and luxury. To the Egyptians, beauty reached beyond a single lifetime. One did not simply prepare the face for the living world, one adorned oneself for eternity, because in Egypt even the dead were expected to look divine. In ancient Greece, beauty edged toward philosophy in the most literal sense. The Greeks believed that a person's physical appearance reflected their moral character, and to be beautiful was to be kalos kagathos, noble and good. Sculptors carved their gods in idealized proportions, not so much to flatter the divine as to show mortals what perfection might look like. That same devotion to harmony and balance flowed into their grooming and cosmetics. For Greek women, the ideal was fair skin, a sign of purity, of standing, and of freedom from labor beneath the sun. A pale complexion announced that one was wealthy enough to remain indoors. To achieve it, women applied white lead, hazardous by any modern reckoning, or a natural pale clay, and some reached for chalk or crushed pearls. This was less about vanity than about signaling membership in the elite. Cheeks and lips were tinted with natural pigments, often drawn from red ochre, crushed berries, or the root of the madder plant. A touch of rouge suggested vitality and youth, and a subtle lip stain hinted at sensuality without crossing the bounds of decorum. Greek taste shied away from extremes. A little colour was elegant, while too much was scandalous. Eyes were defined with soot or charcoal, less theatrical than Egyptian kohl, but enough to enhance their shape and lend a soft, shadowed look. Eyebrows were ideally joined into the famous single line, which was regarded as a mark of intelligence and purity. Women even darkened the space between the brows with powder or filled it in with pigment. Hair received the same attention. Women lightened their hair with vinegar and sunlight, or used saffron to coax out golden tones, since fair hair was associated with gods and heroes. Styles ran from intricate braids to tightly wound buns, often finished with ribbons, pins, or wreaths of gold. Men, for their part, favoured well-kept beards and curls, a poise between ruggedness and refinement. Greek beauty was never about excess. It was about restraint, proportion, and the quiet projection of inner virtue, cosmetics used with discretion, meant to enhance nature rather than mask it. In public, a woman's modesty came first, yet in more private settings, during symposia and festivals, beauty could become a soft form of persuasion. In ancient Greece, to be beautiful was not to stand apart from others, but to embody the harmony of the gods. In ancient Rome, beauty served as both weapon and performance. Where the Greeks prized restrained elegance, the Romans took to cosmetics with boldness and flourish. From the wives of emperors to courtesans and enslaved people hoping to rise by their looks, appearance meant power, and no one pretended otherwise. A flawless complexion was the Roman ideal, and pale skin once again signalled status, a sign that one did not toil outdoors. To reach it, Roman women turned to an array of whitening agents, white lead, chalk, and even, remarkably, crocodile dung mixed with vinegar, while some added powdered horn or oyster shell for a faint glow. Face masks of honey, barley, or milk were prized among the wealthy, and recipes for beauty passed between elite households like closely guarded secrets. Rouge and lip colour, too, were always in high demand. Red ochre, cinnabar, and the juice of crushed mulberries were all pressed into service to colour cheeks and lips, and a Roman woman often built the effect up in thin layers until it fairly glowed. Where Greek taste had leaned toward restraint, Roman women showed no such fear of colour, and yet the boundary between what counted as tasteful and what counted as garish was argued over endlessly in poems, letters, and idle gossip. A carefully painted face could announce wealth, or desirability, or a scandalous reputation, depending entirely on who happened to be looking. The poet Ovid even composed a short treatise on the making of such preparations, so the subject was clearly one that occupied educated minds, and not only the dressing table. To pale the complexion, the fashionable turned to white lead and to chalk, spreading it smooth across the skin, indifferent to the slow damage the lead could work over the years. A heightened rouge was then set over it for the sought-after contrast of pallor and bloom. The eyes were treated with real drama. Roman women deepened their lashes and lids with soot, with antimony, and sometimes with the ash of burnt rose petals. A dark line drawn around the eye lengthened it into an almond shape that echoed the fashions of Egypt, and shadow was to be had in greens, blues, and earthy browns. Eyebrows were shaped with equal attention, darkened with burnt cork or fine ash, and plucking was simply expected. A well-appointed lady's mirror was usually accompanied by a pair of tweezers. Perfume, though, was the great Roman passion. The wealthy layered scent upon scent, rose, cinnamon, myrrh, and spikenard, through every room of the house, every fold of clothing, and every strand of hair. Ointments were kept in alabaster and in glass vessels shipped from Egypt, Syria, and Arabia. and a particular fragrance could become as recognizable as a name. Men indulged too, scenting their togas and even the household servants, a habit that moralists such as Seneca were fond of scolding as fragrant excess. Wigs and hairpieces sustained a thriving trade. Blonde wigs, prized especially when the hair had come from Germanic captives, were fashionable among the Roman elite. Hair was built up high in intricate coils and waves, secured with pins of ivory, silver, and occasionally gold, and the wealthiest households kept dedicated hairdressers, the ornatrices, as essential staff. In Rome, cosmetics were never only a matter of looking well. They were a matter of standing, of ambition, of quiet social performance. Every pigment, every scent, every braid told onlookers precisely who a person was, or who they hoped to be taken for. Further east, in the crowded cities of ancient Mesopotamia, Babylon, and Nineveh, beauty could not be separated from magic, medicine, and the divine. In this cradle of some of the earliest civilizations, cosmetics were far more than instruments of seduction or rank. They were charms against misfortune, gestures of piety, and ingredients in rituals meant to transform the person who used them. Men and women alike attached great importance to grooming, and scented oils and balms sat at the very centre of daily life. In such a dry land, these were more than moisturizers. They were thought to carry a divine charge, so that anointing the skin was at once a matter of hygiene and of holiness, a way of bringing the body into agreement with the gods. Oils were pressed from sesame, almonds, and olives, then steeped with myrrh, cedarwood, or frankincense. The eyes were the focus of Mesopotamian beauty. As in Egypt, dark pigment was laid along the lids and lashes, valued not only for its striking look, but as a guard against evil spirits and disease. Charcoal, lead, and ground minerals were mixed into pastes and kept in small stone jars. The wide, exaggerated eyes that stare out of Mesopotamian statues were not an artistic flourish. They recorded a genuine habit of adornment. Recipes for face creams and skin treatments were pressed into clay tablets, calling for crushed date stones, beeswax, and milk to soften and lighten the complexion. Clay masks addressed blemishes, and scrubs of salt or ash smoothed the skin. Among the elite, grooming manuals were not unusual, early beauty advice in which the boundary between science and sorcery had not yet been firmly drawn. Hair was arranged with care and complexity. Women oiled it to keep it glossy and obedient, then braided it into elaborate patterns or wound it into buns, dressing it with ribbons, beads, and bronze pins. Wigs were less common than along the Nile, but false braids and hairpieces added fullness and displayed wealth. Most intriguing of all was the tie between beauty and magic. Incantations frequently mention adornment. A spell might direct that a particular oil or pigment be applied in order to draw love or favor. Such rituals were sometimes overseen by temple priests and priestesses, above all those who served Ishtar, goddess of love, beauty, and war. Here beauty was a form of enchantment, each act of adornment a small ceremony, each glance in the mirror something like a conversation with the divine. In the ancient cities of the Indus Valley, Harappa, Mohenjo-Daro, and Lothal, beauty left its mark not in surviving texts, but in terracotta objects, slender tools, and the faint shimmer of powdered color. No decipherable script explains their daily routines, so the cosmetic life of the Indus speaks instead through its things, quiet, refined, and deeply personal. Among the ruins, archaeologists have recovered small mirrors of polished bronze, finely carved combs, and oval terracotta palettes still faintly dusted with red. These were the ordinary tools of self-care, and they suggest that grooming was a steady and valued part of life. One of the most telling finds is the common use of red pigment, most likely drawn from hematite or iron oxide, applied to lips, cheeks, and perhaps the forehead. This was more than decoration. It may have marked fertility, spiritual devotion, or marital status. Much as the bindi would in later Indian tradition, the colour red, sacred and vital, has long stood at the heart of South Asian aesthetics, and its roots may reach as far back as the Indus itself. Bathing was a shared ritual. The great bath of Mohenjo-daro, with its brick-lined steps and encircling chambers, points to a culture that prized cleanliness for the sake of spiritual purity as much as hygiene. Oils, perhaps scented with local herbs such as sandalwood, turmeric and vetiver, would have been worked into the skin before and after bathing to soften it and settle the senses. Hair was tended with equal care, likely oiled and gathered into buns or braids. Figurines show women in elaborate styles hung with ornaments. Some scholars believe the people of the Indus used natural plant dyes such as indigo and henna to colour hair and mark the body, early forms of tradition still alive across the subcontinent today. Fragrance had its place as well. Written records are scarce, but botanical evidence hints at aromatic resins and herbs, and incense burners found in homes and shrines suggest a blending of scent, sanctity, and everyday routine. In the Indus Valley, cosmetics were quiet symbols, worn not for spectacle but for balance, identity, and perhaps even love, deliberate, subtle, and enduring. In ancient China, beauty mirrored the natural world, delicate, balanced, and thick with meaning. To be beautiful was to call to mind the calm of a plum blossom, the purity of jade, the poise of a crane in flight. Across the dynasties, from the Han to the Tang, Chinese cosmetics matured into a refined and almost poetic ritual, an art form painted onto the living face. Pale skin was the foundation of the ideal. As in many older cultures, a fair complexion signalled wealth and refinement, proof that one did not labour beneath the sun. Women whitened their faces with rice powder, layering it toward a smooth porcelain finish. Some blended in pearl dust or powdered lead, unaware of the harm the lead could do over time. Blush was applied softly, in petal-like shades rather than hard circles, and one Tang fashion set delicate painted marks on the cheeks and sometimes the forehead, taking their cue from the colours of flowers or the flush of affection. Lips, too, made a statement. Red cinnabar tinted them into a small, heart-shaped form, the outer edges left pale, a contrast that prized delicacy and restraint, a whisper of sensuality rather than a shout. Eyebrows were an art of their own. Fashion shifted with each dynasty, straight, arched, or curved like a swallow's wing. Women shaved the natural brow and redrew it with charcoal or black ink, and scrolls from the Tang and Song set out dozens of distinct shapes with names as lovely as willow leaf and distant mountains. Ornament raised beauty toward theatre. Women wore huadian, tiny floral or jewel-like forehead decals cut from gold leaf, paper, or pressed petals, symbols of youth, wealth, or the turning of the seasons. Perfume and skincare mattered too. Scented oils of orchid, lotus, and musk were massaged into the skin, while herbal masks of ginseng and green tea promised clarity and long life. Beauty here was not merely cosmetic, but medicinal, philosophical, even moral. To be beautiful was to stand in harmony with heaven and earth, a living poem of colour, scent, and grace. In ancient Mesoamerica, among the Olmec, Maya, and Aztec, beauty was vivid, ceremonial, and bound up with the spirit world. Unlike societies where cosmetics belonged mainly to elite women, here both men and women adorned themselves with purpose. Appearance was never only about attraction, it was about identity, ritual, and a sense of cosmic connection. Red was the most sacred color, standing for life, blood, and the sun. Women tinted their lips with achiote seeds, which yielded a deep crimson, and colored their cheeks with cochineal, a brilliant red dye drawn from insects harvested on the cactus. Black and white gave contrast, shaping the face or ringing the eyes with charcoal and powdered lime. Body painting was widespread and often ritual. Pigments were applied for festivals, for war, and for religious ceremony. Warriors painted their faces to unsettle their enemies and honor the gods. Priests whitened themselves with ash or chalk to purify their bodies for ceremony, and young women wore subtle facial marks during courtship. Fragrance carried divine weight. The Aztecs cherished flowers, xochitl, using them in offerings and in personal adornment alike. Marigolds, plumeria, and cacao blossoms were braided into garlands or crushed into pastes and smoothed onto the skin, and copal, a sacred tree resin, was burned as incense and blended with oils to perfume the body before ritual. Hairstyles carried meaning too. Maya women wore long, thick braids coiled atop the head or twisted into buns, sometimes set with jade beads or feathers, while Aztec noble women used hairpieces, ribbons, and even gold dust. Men, especially warriors, arranged their hair by rank, with shaved patterns or elaborate knots that spoke of courage in battle. Tattooing and scarification were practiced as well, particularly among the Maya, where such permanent marks were not ornament, but badges of endurance, devotion, and spiritual passage. Even the teeth were adorned. Elites had inlays of jade or turquoise set into them as signs of status and divine favor. For the peoples of Mesoamerica, beauty was sacred, every pigment, flower, and braid a symbol bridging the earthly body and the heavens. In the misty forests and wind-swept hills of ancient Europe, the Celts cultivated a beauty at once fierce and earthy, wild yet deliberate. They kept neither the ornate rituals of Rome nor the polished elegance of Egypt, but appearance mattered to them no less. To the Celts, grooming and adornment marked vitality, courage, and the identity of the tribe, and even their warriors kept a favoured comb close at hand. Men and women alike attended to how they looked. Bronze combs, razors, and tweezers turn up in their graves, evidence that personal grooming was esteemed. Hair was held to be sacred, and both sexes often wore it long and wavy, stiffened with lime or animal fat for volume, the source of the spiked or swept-back look that so unsettled their foes. The most famous element of Celtic appearance, though, was woad, the blue dye drawn from the Asatis tinctoria plant. Warriors traced swirling patterns across their faces and bodies with it, partly to intimidate in battle, and partly for ceremonial or spiritual reasons. Just how widespread the practice truly was remains debated, yet classical writers such as Julius Caesar found it striking enough to record. Jewelry, meanwhile, was essential, worn not only for beauty but as a plain statement of identity and of rank. Fashioned by skilled metalworkers and often finished with ornate terminals, the torque announced standing at a single glance, and some were valued enough to be buried with their owners or offered up to the gods, so that a length of worked gold spoke as clearly of a person's place in the world as any. The great emblem of that rank was the torque, a heavy neck ring of twisted gold or bronze that circled the throat of a chieftain or a proven warrior. Painted face in Rome. Among the Celts, personal adornment carried a weight that went far beyond decoration. Neck rings called torques, twisted from gold or bronze, were worn with open pride by men and women alike, and around them gathered earrings, bracelets and hairpins that caught the daylight. To read these ornaments as mere jewellery would be to overlook what they truly said. Each piece announced something about the person who wore it: physical strength, the lineage they descended from, and the honour they carried through their days. The torque, in particular, became almost a signature of the Celtic world, heavy at the throat, gleaming against the skin, worn even into battle by warriors who wished their standing to be seen before a single word was spoken. Classical writers noticed as much. Greek and Roman observers such as Polybius and Diodorus Siculus described Celtic fighters who went into battle wearing little more than a torque of gold, and the famous Roman sculpture known as the Dying Gaul preserves exactly that image, a fallen warrior bare but for the ring at his neck. Makeup, by comparison, was a subtler art, yet it was certainly present. Red ochre coloured the cheeks and lips, favoured especially by women of noble rank. Tattoos and body paint likely played their own quiet part in storytelling, marking the turning points of a life, the tribe a person belonged to, or a spiritual milestone that others were meant to recognise. Animal imagery ran deep through Celtic belief, and it is more than plausible that some of this body art echoed that bond with the creatures of forest and field. Mirrors, too, tell us something. Polished discs of bronze with elaborately decorated backs have been found in the graves of high-status women, a sign that the care one took with one's appearance carried both social and sacred meaning. For the Celts, beauty was never merely about attraction. It was tied to who a person was. A warrior kept well and neatly groomed was seen as disciplined and self-possessed. A woman finely adorned was read as wise and commanding. In this world, beauty was raw, elemental, and threaded through with pride. It honoured both the soil under their feet and the spirits they believed watched patiently from the trees. Across the ancient world, beauty did not simply end when life did. It followed the body into death. From the embalmed faces of Egyptian mummies to the perfumed remains prepared for Roman funerals, cosmetics were never only instruments of vanity or rank. They were treated as offerings to the divine, as gestures of respect toward the dead, and as tokens of a person's identity meant to be carried into eternity. In ancient Egypt, this conviction was especially vivid. The dead were laid to rest with their cosmetic palettes, their containers of coal, and their vessels of scented oil arranged with care inside the tomb, alongside shabty figurines and protective amulets. The coal itself was ground from minerals such as galena and green malachite, and beyond darkening the eyes it was believed to guard against the glare of the sun and the infections that came with it, so that even in the tomb it carried a double promise of beauty and protection. The reasoning was straightforward within their beliefs. To appear presentable in the afterlife genuinely mattered, for one was expected to stand before the gods looking worthy of them. Tomb paintings show the departed in full array, their cheeks touched with colour, their heads crowned with elaborate wigs, their eyes drawn in flawless black lines. Beauty, in this understanding, was eternal, and cosmetics ranked alongside food and water as provisions for the long journey ahead. The Romans took the grooming of the dead just as seriously. Wealthy Romans prepared their bodies with myrrh, cinnamon, and spikenard. Perfumed oils slowed decay and softened its odour, but they did more than that. They lifted the body towards something dignified and almost divine. Roman funerals were public occasions, displays of a family's wealth and virtue, and a corpse tended with obvious care reflected honour back onto every living relative. Among the Greeks, funeral rites included washing the body, dressing it in fine cloth, and anointing it with oils and garlands. Mirrors, combs, and cosmetic instruments were buried beside women, particularly those of aristocratic families. This was not vanity carried past its natural end. It was remembrance. Such objects spoke on the deceased's behalf, saying that here had lain someone refined, admired, and bound to the ordered beauty the Greeks associated with the divine. In Mesopotamia, oils and incense were used to anoint the dead as part of solemn ritual. Cosmetic substances were thought to hold protective virtue, turning away malevolent forces and easing the passage into the underworld. Death was not imagined as the erasure of beauty, but as its transformation into something larger and more lasting. Even in the burials of prehistoric peoples, red ochre has been found scattered across human remains, perhaps standing for blood, for rebirth, or for the vitality that once filled the living. It hints that the urge to beautify and sanctify the body in death reaches back as far as human society itself. Across cultures and long stretches of time, cosmetics formed a bridge between the mortal and the divine. In life they dazzled, in death they consecrated. Beauty, by this reckoning, was never fleeting. It was meant to endure. Far beneath the restless rhythm of modern Istanbul, below the calls to prayer, the horns of the ferries crossing the Bosphorus, and the footsteps of visitors moving between mosques and markets, there is a pocket of stillness. It is a cool, echoing, ancient kind of silence. Descend a stone staircase, and the temperature drops. The air turns damp. The noise of the city fades, and the basilica cistern opens up all around, wide and dim and waiting. Built in the 6th century under Emperor Justinian the Great, the basilica cistern, known in Turkish as Yerebat and Sarnishi, is the largest surviving underground water reservoir left to us by the Byzantine Empire. It has the feel of a hidden cathedral of water, vast, brooding, and as quiet as a tomb. More than 300 feet long and 200 feet wide, it once held as much as 80,000 cubic meters of water, enough to serve the Great Palace of Constantinople and the buildings surrounding it. Yet this was never a plain utilitarian tank. The Byzantines gave ambition even to their water storage. The chamber is carried by 336 marble columns, most of them rising more than 9 meters, set out in 12 orderly rows. The ceilings they support curve gently into vaults, producing the illusion of a cathedral sunk beneath the earth. Reflections shimmer underfoot, and the whole space feels like a threshold to the underworld, lit only by the glint of water and the occasional soft glow of a spotlight. The water itself was drawn from the distant Belgrade forest and carried in along aqueducts that ran for miles. In Constantinople, water was survival. The city had been besieged more times than anyone could easily count, and in seasons of war, when aqueducts were severed and fountains ran dry, the cistern kept life flowing quietly beneath the streets. For a long stretch of time, the cistern was forgotten entirely. After the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople in 1453, it slipped out of public memory. Its entrances were sealed, its purpose lost to the years. People in the neighborhood spoke of houses with strangely wet basements, and a few even drew fish up through their floors. It was not until the 16th century that the French scholar Petrus Gillius, following stories of townspeople who lowered buckets and even hauled fish from beneath their own homes, traced the rumours down into the dark and brought the cistern back to notice. Today it stands not only as a monument to Byzantine ingenuity, but as a strange, dreamlike echo of an empire that once ruled much of the known world, a place where time seems to drip slowly from the ceiling, and the memory of emperors lingers among the columns. To make sense of the Basilica Sistine, one must first make sense of the man behind it, Emperor Justinian the Great, ruler of the Eastern Roman Empire in the 6th century. Justinian was not content to preserve the legacy of old Rome, he meant to surpass it. He raised cathedrals, courts, walls, and aqueducts, a declaration in stone and mortar that Constantinople was the new Rome. Beneath the city's very foundations, he built a marvel almost no one would ever see. Construction of the cistern began around the year 532, soon after the Nika riots had burned half the city to ash. In the smouldering aftermath, Justinian ordered a new underground reservoir that would supply his rebuilt imperial palace and also hold firm against siege and fire. It was at once a precaution and a message. Constantinople would never go thirsty, and its emperor would never falter. The reservoir was raised on the site of a former basilica, which is how it earned its name, and it demanded enormous resources. Thousands of labourers, prisoners of war among them, hollowed out a space nearly the size of a cathedral beneath the streets. The finished chamber measured roughly 138 metres by 64, held up by those 336 columns, many of them spolia, older pieces taken from Roman and Greek temples. Reusing columns was not simply thrifty, it carried meaning. Justinian was, quite literally, building a new empire upon the bones of the old. Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian capitals stand together in the dark, reminders that the grandeur of Rome had been inherited, reshaped, and lowered beneath the new capital. The engineering was remarkable. Vaulted ceilings spread the weight evenly. Brick walls were sealed with thick coats of mortar, and arched supports guarded against collapse. Most importantly, the cistern was fed by the Valens and Hadrian aqueducts, some of which stretched more than 19 kilometres from the Belgrade forest, keeping vast reserves ready for drought, fire, or blockade. And yet its truest brilliance was its invisibility. It did not boast. It hid. The public never laid eyes on it. There were no triumphal arches, no gilded mosaics, only quiet, dark usefulness beating like a subterranean heart beneath the city's splendour. To step inside is to feel less like entering a reservoir and more like wandering into a forgotten temple. A forest of stone rises up, hundreds of marble columns in ordered rows, their reflections trembling across black water. The silence breaks only for the occasional drip from above, echoing like the breath of the past. The columns are not identical, and that is part of what makes them so haunting. Some are smooth, others fluted, their capitals ranging from Ionic scrolls to Corinthian leaves, with a few that seem almost improvised. This is because so many were spolia, gathered from earlier ruins, a mosaic of empires held within a single structure. Most rise around 9 metres, and the marble, steeped in centuries of moisture, glows faintly in the dim light, its yellows, greys, and pinks flickering across the stone. 2 columns stand apart. One, the weeping column, is carved with swirling shapes like peacock eyes or falling tears, and legend holds that a drop from it brings good fortune, a gentle myth for a place already heavy with memory. Their arrangement into 12 rows of 28 was no accident, for even in a chamber few were meant to see, the Byzantines held that beauty and function were never truly separate. Over the long centuries, algae and mineral crusts softened the carved lines, roots worked their way through cracks in the ceiling, and time, like the water itself, wore every edge smooth. Only in the 20th century was the chamber cleaned and fitted with raised walkways, so that visitors might move above the shallow pool where the water had once stood many feet deep. In the far northwest corner, tucked beneath two columns, rest the most enigmatic relics of the whole place, two great stone heads of Medusa. One lies on its side, the other upside down, without inscription or explanation, two ancient faces gazing out from beneath the water. No one is entirely certain where they came from, though scholars believe they were carried here from a Roman temple or public building and set to work as column bases. They are fine examples of Roman stonework, expressive and unsettlingly lifelike, yet here they sit, repurposed into structural filler. The odd angles have puzzled historians for centuries. Some argue the positioning was purely practical, a way to make the blocks fit. Others suspect intention, a symbolic move to neutralize Medusa's petrifying gaze by turning it away underground. In Greek myth, her severed head was carried by Perseus even after her death, and became an apotropaic image meant to ward off evil, appearing on shields, coins, and doorways. Perhaps then she was placed here, not as a punishment, but as a guardian, quietly watching over the water that kept a great city alive. Even now, travellers slow their steps when they reach the Medusa heads, and their voices sink to a hush. The air near those stones seems to grow heavier, as though it has been resting there for centuries and has no wish to be disturbed. Whether or not a person believes in the old myths, the effect is the same. In the Basilica cistern, you do not simply look at Medusa. You feel her ancient gaze turn quietly back on you. And to understand why this place carries such weight, it helps to remember what water once meant to the city above. In old Constantinople, water was not a convenience. It was survival itself. The city was renowned for its towering ramparts, its churches sheathed in gold, its imperial courts thick with ceremony. Yet without water, all of that splendor was only a gilded tomb waiting to be sealed. For this reason, the Basilica cistern was never merely a triumph of architecture. It was a weapon of endurance. Hidden beneath the streets, it worked as a silent lifeline through seasons of siege, drought, and disaster. The Byzantine capital lived under near-constant threat, ringed for hundreds of years by rivals who wanted what it held. Persians came, and Arabs, and Bulgars, and later the Crusaders, and the city withstood one siege after another. One of the most punishing was the Arab siege of 717 to 718, when the defenders were pressed for well over a year and every mouthful of food and water had to be counted. Aqueducts running above the ground could always be severed or fouled by an enemy, but reserves sealed underground and stocked in advance could not be so easily reached. That difference is part of why Constantinople did not fall in those desperate months. The Basilica cistern, with its enormous capacity, helped carry the palace and the surrounding districts through the long, grinding days of thirst. The water that filled it began its journey far outside the walls. It was drawn from the Belgrade forest, more than 19 kilometers away, and carried toward the city along a chain of elevated aqueducts. The most famous of these was the Valens Aqueduct, a great 4th century Roman work whose arches still stride across Istanbul today. From these channels, the water fed into open-air reservoirs and into covered chambers like this one. What set the Basilica cistern apart was that it was both roofed and buried, shielded from heat, from sunlight, and from the contamination that could poison an exposed pool. In an age when a whole city could die of thirst behind its own walls, that quiet advantage was close to revolutionary. Yet water in this world was more than a matter of tactics. It was also a matter of meaning. In Byzantine theology and in the imagery of empire, water stood for life, for rebirth, and for the favour of the divine. To command it, and above all to command it while an enemy waited outside the gates, was to show that heaven still smiled on the city. That is why so many of Constantinople's waterworks were built not only to function, but to inspire. Much of it took the shape we know under the Emperor Justinian in the 6th century, and many of its 336 columns were gathered from older buildings, their carved capitals mismatched and reused, so that the chamber holds fragments of an even deeper past within its ranks. Even during the Ottoman conquest of 1453, while the city overhead was falling and aflame, the waters below lay untroubled and still. After the conquest, the cistern was largely set aside, sealed away, and left unused. But through the final Byzantine years, it had done exactly what it was made to do. Today, as tourists wander among its pillars, few of them realize they are standing above one of the most important defenses the empire ever possessed. Not a blade and not a wall, but something far harder to seize. Silence, water, and time. For close to a century after the conquest, the basilica cistern lay in that silence. The Ottomans were gifted engineers in their own right, and they built new aqueducts and fountains to serve the growing city above. The older Byzantine waterworks, tucked underground and unmarked, slipped out of common memory. No one boasted of the cistern. There were no plaques, no maps, no ceremonies to mark it, only still water beneath the paving stones. And yet the place would not consent to be forgotten. In the neighbourhoods around Hagia Sophia, residents began to notice odd things. Some found their basements damp the whole year through, no matter the season outside. Others said they could lower a bucket through a hole in the floor and draw up cold, clean water. A few even claimed to be pulling fish out of the ground, a small and improbable wonder happening quietly beneath the busy Ottoman streets. It was not until the 1540s that the cistern was formally rediscovered, through the curious eyes of Petrus Gillius, a French scholar and traveller. He had been sent to Constantinople by King Francis I of France to study ancient texts and monuments, and he had a habit of asking more questions than most people wished to answer. When he heard the stories of families drawing water and fish from the floors of their homes, he set out to learn where such a thing could come from. In time he found an entrance, most likely through a private house, and descended into the murky dark below. What waited there astonished him. It was a subterranean hall larger than many of the cathedrals of Europe, filled with columns, black water, and the slow drip of echoes. He moved through the chamber by candlelight, sketching and measuring as he went, noting the carved capitals and the mysterious Medusa heads half sunk in the shadows. Through his writings, Gillius introduced the basilica cistern to the wider world, a lost marvel of Byzantium preserved beneath the Ottoman capital. Even so, his discovery did not lead at once to restoration or to public access. The cistern stayed mostly hidden, used now and then as a source of water, but otherwise left in its half-forgotten obscurity. The Ottoman Empire had grand projects of its own to occupy it, and this was, for the moment, a relic. Beautiful, certainly, but buried in the past. Centuries would pass before it was drained, cleaned, and opened as a monument in its own right. Today, when visitors go down the dim stairway near Hagia Sophia and enter the Basilica cistern, they meet more than an old ruin. They step into a living monument, a place where architecture, atmosphere and memory blur into one another. Lit by amber light and filled with the soft sound of falling water, the chamber feels less like a stop on a tour and more like a slow, wordless ritual. It was not always so gentle to visit. When Turkish authorities chose to restore and reopen the cistern in the late 20th century, they found a flooded wreck choked with centuries of mud, algae and decay. The columns were stained, the floor invisible beneath water and sediment. But the structure itself was sound. It had endured earthquakes, fires, wars, and long abandonment, and through all of it, it had held its ceiling high. After careful cleaning and repair, raised walkways were laid just above the surface of the water. The lighting was chosen with patience, so that it would trace the graceful curves of the columns and let them repeat in the dark mirror below. The result feels less like a reservoir than an underground cathedral, and it is no accident that some visitors call it the sunken palace. In the quiet, you begin to hear it, the echo. Every footstep, every whisper, every drop of water travels through the stone like a chant carried from some other world. It is haunting and beautiful and strangely timeless, and it is little wonder that filmmakers and artists have been drawn here. The Basilica cistern has appeared in films such as From Russia with Love and Inferno, and in countless documentaries and music videos besides. It is not only a historical site, it has become a stage. People are often surprised by how much emotion the space stirs in them. Children lower their voices without being told. Travelers slow their pace. Even the most distracted visitor pauses before the Medusa heads, brooding half submerged in the gloom. There is something magnetic in the place. It never demands reverence aloud, and yet it quietly draws it out of nearly everyone who enters. In recent years, the cistern has hosted art installations, concerts and exhibitions. Modern light displays play across the reflections, turning the chamber into a shifting pool of colour and sound, so that this hidden room is, in its own way, more alive now than at any point in its long life. A place once concealed has been given a fresh meaning. From an imperial necessity, it has risen again into an artistic sanctuary, not through fire or conquest, but through silence, water and light. In a city that has watched empires climb and fall, water has remained Istanbul's oldest and most patient witness. The Basilica cistern is far more than a storage vault. It holds centuries of symbolism, standing not only as a resource, but as a spiritual and philosophical presence. The Byzantines and the Ottomans who came after them both understood that water was never only about thirst. It spoke of purification, of power, and of the thin veil that seemed to separate one world from the next. The water in the cistern moves slowly. It does not rush and it does not speak. It ripples and it reflects. Light plays across its surface and softly breaks the symmetry of the columns, and in that stillness there is a kind of sacred theatre, one that turns the attention gently inward. Like a mirror, the cistern gives back not only light, but history, identity, and myth. In Byzantine belief, water lay at the very heart of rebirth. Baptism, the most essential of Christian rites, was a watery crossing from death toward life, from sin toward purity. The Basilica cistern was never used for ceremony, yet its atmosphere evokes that same threshold. You descend into the earth and meet darkness, then light, then silence, and it feels like passing through a rite that is unspoken but unmistakably solemn. It served as infrastructure, but also as a kind of quiet reassurance. The emperor's court did not rest on dry ground alone, it rested above flowing, living water. Beneath every throne, a river. Beneath every law, a reflection. The Ottomans, too, held water in deep regard. Their gardens, palaces, and mosques were arranged around fountains and pools. In Islam, water suggested divine mercy, rahmah, and the water features woven into their architecture reminded the faithful of paradise. The basilica cistern may have been a Byzantine creation, but it settled easily into this Ottoman way of seeing the world, cool and hidden and endlessly flowing. And beyond faith, there is a simpler, human symbolism as well. To walk through the cistern is to feel more than awe. It stirs memory. The way the light filters between the columns, the hush of steps crossing the water, the slow drip from a ceiling that seems almost to breathe, all of it belongs to a place that never hurries to reveal itself. It waits, the way water waits, the way history waits. The basilica cistern is hidden no longer. It stands proudly among Istanbul's most visited places, a haunting and majestic reminder that the true heart of the city beats not only in its minarets and mosques, but deep beneath the ground. Millions descend its steps each year, not merely to study ancient hydraulics, but to feel the weight of time pressing gently from the walls. In a city crowded with noise and motion, this is one of the rare rooms where silence still holds sway. People instinctively whisper, and even the click of a camera shutter can feel too loud. And yet there is life here too, in the steady stream of visitors, in the subtle shifting of the light, in the small splashes and the occasional performances that bring the chamber briefly roaring back into the present. Restoration has been careful and deliberate. The columns have been cleaned, the supports reinforced, the walkways improved, and yet great care has been taken not to strip away the very things that make the place feel otherworldly: the soft light, the cool air, the low murmur of dripping water. It remains an engineering marvel, but it is also a reminder that infrastructure can be beautiful, even mystical. While the modern world argues over whether things should be useful or lovely, the Byzantines simply built a water tank as elegant as a cathedral, and that gentle contradiction still stops visitors in their tracks. Above, Istanbul hums with new energy. Trams glide past ancient stones, and vendors sell roasted chestnuts beside Roman ruins. Directly below all of it lies the basilica cistern, unmoved and unbothered, holding the stories of emperors and architects, invaders and dreamers, all of them softened now into echoes in the damp stone. Here time does not feel like a straight line. It loops like water circling a basin, and for a moment past and present meet in the quiet, and you are no longer only in Istanbul, but in Byzantium, in Constantinople, in a shadow world that never truly left.